Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we'll discuss the third Sunday after Lent, which this year falls on March 20th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, our deep dive today is on the topic of theodicy, not the Odyssey by Homer, the ancient poet. I once had a very painful 10-minute conversation where I thought I was talking about the concept of theodicy, and my conversation partner, who has been a guest on this podcast, thought we were talking about the Odyssey by Homer. And after a while, we figured it out, but it was a very, possibly we hadn't had our coffee yet. That's very possible. But it was an exhausting day. The question of theodicy is this. If God is all loving and all powerful, and also presumably actually exists, then why does evil exist? Why is there evil in the world? Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, there's a book on that exact topic with that exact title, and I do actually recommend that you read it because it's super interesting and useful. It's called Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? And it's by a Jewish rabbi whose name I'm not remembering off the top of my head, but it is a super useful and I thought very accessible and readable conversation about all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a bunch of different ideas around this concept. For example, one person whose name was Leibniz, who was also known as the guy who, if Isaac Newton didn't invent calculus first, then Leibniz did. Isaac Newton claimed to invent calculus first, but his ability to provide proof that his notes were older than Leibniz's notes were not great. So there's a certain amount of disagreement on that. But one or the other of them invented calculus.
Interestingly, most high schoolers can then be mad at one of them, and
yes.
I will be just extra grateful because I love math and calculus.
Cool.
It's fun.
Leibniz, like many rich, educated white men who had nothing better to do with their time during that era, was not just a mathematician, but also was a philosopher, and actually put out a few useful ideas, one of which was the concept of the best of all possible worlds. What if the answer to why does evil exist is that the universe is just a deeply complex and complicated place, and this is the best possible version of it? Like, there is no possible way that the universe could exist in all its complexity that would be better than this, or less evil, or involve less suffering. And that's an interesting idea, but there's basically no way to prove it. And also, like, it seems like there's an awful lot of evil and suffering in this world. So it's an interesting idea, but you can't do that much with it. But it does exist and is out there. Also, I feel like we should note early in this conversation that when we talk about evil, there's evil and then there's suffering, and not all suffering comes from evil sources. Like, for example, natural disasters and science-related things like cancer, those aren't actually evil. That's just, science being science. Like, the way that the climate works on our planet means that there's going to be some natural disasters. I grew up with tornadoes. Some people grew up with hurricanes, etc.
Avalanches.
Yeah. And the way that our bodies work means that sometimes things like cancer or various other illnesses happen. And our bodies, if they weren't capable of doing those things that cause pain and suffering, also wouldn't be able to work, basically. Like, I'm not a biologist. Don't ask me to explain how vaccines work, but I do understand that they are sufficiently complex that they also have to be able to go a little haywire in some weird ways, like, say, cancer or other types of sickness, in order for them to work the way they do.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of that, right, is that evolution and the development of life is largely due to accidents.
Yes.
And the place where I love the line that I love the most about this is in Interstellar, the movie, when they're exploring planets, and Brandt has a lot of reasons for wanting to go to Edmondson's planet, some of which are questionable. But her argument that on a planet orbiting that close to a black hole, there's not as much possibility for life because there's not as much possibility for accidents to happen. Sure. Because the black hole sucks everything in. And so it's those spaces where we do create possibilities for accidents, that things can evolve and genes get switched and mutate and
Yeah.
that sort of a thing.
Yeah, the world is also an incredibly messy place, and that leads to a lot of stuff, both good and bad as well. Yeah.
For sure. Also, when we are thinking about new life and resurrection and all of that, presumably death has to happen in order for new life to happen. I know there have been multiple dystopias and those sorts of things that depict what if people stopped dying?
Yeah.
And the reality is, it would take days before we're so overpopulated that like
Yeah.
nobody could survive.
And also, a lot of those people would be in a lot of pain and miserable. And yeah.
And so, like, yes, there are ways where death can be evil, particularly when it comes to killing and the
Sure.
taking of life. But death in and of itself is not an evil. It is part of a cycle. If we didn't have death, like, things wouldn't nourish the earth to grow the plants and like feed the animals, and
Sure.
there just wouldn't be cycles of life. And those of you who eat meat would be in trouble, because if there's no death, there's no meat to eat, folks.
Well, I hate to tell you this, Emily, but like, in order to eat vegetables, there also has to be death. Otherwise,
Details.
we'd be covered in vegetation, and
I
probably rhubarb
mean,
would have devoured the world by now. So,
true. Vegetable death is just not as, like, it's not sentient.
I don't know. I've seen some pretty mean rhubarb plants. I almost lost a shed to one.
I do love rhubarb. I make a good rhubarb sauce. Anyway,
But is it morally good, or does it just taste yummy?
both, because it helps keep the rhubarb plant both growing and contained.
Excellent.
And all of this also raises a question, particularly in the capitalist hellscape in which we live, that is raised on The Good Place. So, for those of you who haven't seen The Good Place, there's like spoilers here, but they end up in like the last season or later seasons realizing that in fact no one has been going to the good place for a very long time, because within capitalism, it is impossible to make decisions that are completely good.
Yes. And okay, I would actually throw a lot of that blame at capitalism, but probably not 100%. Like, probably the world
Yeah.
is actually just large enough and complicated enough and has enough people with different motivations in it that some of it is not entirely capitalism.
Yes, I think it's not entirely capitalism, and
It's mostly capitalism.
yeah. And there are like decisions and choices that we can make as humans that mitigate some of the evil of capitalism.
Sure.
When we buy something locally or organically, but like, even that, right? If
It's
it's
not going to be
local and not
100%
organic, if
perfect.
it's
Yeah.
organic and not local, there's no way to actually like.
Or if it's both organic and local, and it also happens to be funding a group that does horrible things.
So there's so many complexities in everything we do that like it would be, and I think for some of us, myself included, at times is paralyzing to
Yeah.
try to do only good,
Right.
to try to avoid anything that harms anybody else. And there are like mitigating things that you can do, both in terms of like how you spend your money, but also advocacy around safety and those sorts of things.
Which, come to think of it, brings us back to a line from Martin Luther of sin boldly, but believe more boldly still. Accept the fact that sin is going to happen because it's going to, whether you try or not, and move on with your life, basically, because God's love for you doesn't change anyway.
Yeah, it's a like, don't get paralyzed.
Yeah. Well, in indecision.
Yes,
Like,
sorry.
people
Don't
are.
get paralyzed. Don't get paralyzed in indecision.
Don't get
Don't do the
paralyzed in the middle of a
freeze.
sentence
Yeah.
where you stop.
Don't do the freeze, but instead do the, when there is no clear good
Right.
choice,
Do the best you can.
do the best you can and trust that, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu has said, there's nothing you can do to make God love you anymore, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you any less.
Yeah, absolutely. But that said, Yes, the world is a complicated place, but I think we can also agree that evil does genuinely exist in the world. Like, most of us have seen it. Some of us spend more time looking at it than others.
Some of
And
us are seeing it right now,
hey,
all the time. Oh, not like you. I meant in the world. There's like invasions of countries. There's transphobic bills.
yes, I wish all of you could have seen Emily's face, though. It was beautiful. But yes, evil totally does exist.
Yeah.
Ask yourself what the source of evil is, and generally speaking, once you accept the fact that things like natural disasters and sickness and things like that happen naturally are not, either directed at you or inherently intrinsically evil, you realize that the stuff that is evil, cruelty, poverty, intentionally caused suffering, miserliness, I'm sure there are lots of examples of things that I'm not thinking of right now. Genocide, goodness knows. All of those things come from people, not God. Like, okay, people come from God, but and we can, at the end of time, if we decide that we want to argue with God that the human race never should have existed in the first place, that might actually happen. And honestly, is not the worst argument I've ever heard. Come to think of it.
Yep. Yeah.
But I'm here, so I'm gonna have to deal with something. So the question becomes, okay, well, where does our evil come from? And for the most part, the reason why, as far as we understand, that we can do evil when God is good and does love us and does also exist and is all powerful. The reason for that is because of this concept called free will. The idea that we are able to freely make choices about what we do with our lives on a daily basis, and that freedom of our will is not something that God has taken from us. That freedom is complete. And while we occasionally try to limit each other's free will, we're also not,
Mhm.
omnipotent. And so our ability to do that is limited. The argument I usually wind up having with people, and I mean argument in a philosophical sense, not necessarily a yelling sense, although occasionally yelling happens,
Hmm.
about free will is, but couldn't there just be a little less of it? Like, couldn't we mostly have free will, but like the truly horrifying things not be a possibility? Couldn't God do that for us, right? And then the question
Mhm.
becomes, where do you draw the line? Like, are we saying, okay, so everyone should be alive and healthy and like not genuinely suffering at least until they're 18 because children are innocent, right? And so you're gonna,
Mm.
knock out all kinds of childhood cancer, horrible accidents, lots of abuse, stuff like that. That sounds great, but like then you're still gonna have a bunch of evil that happens to people after they turn 18. And
Mhm.
I have to imagine that the whole all children continue life until they're 18 thing is going to definitely mess with our population numbers, like Emily was saying earlier, with the whole
Mhm.
death has to happen. I mean, I'm not saying children have to die. That's not where this is going. But the way we exist currently as a species on the planet would change dramatically if that
Mhm.
was a rule that God decided to put into place.
Mhm.
Or if you want to say, okay, so like natural suffering is one thing, but what if we just weren't able to murder each other? Like, what if that was a
Yeah.
possibility? Well, okay, great. Are you talking about individual murders? Are you talking about genocide? Are you talking about,
Accidental murder, like
yeah, manslaughter,
manslaughter.
hitting people with your car when you totally didn't mean to?
Mhm.
Does that also take out drunk driving?
How far do you draw the line?
Yeah, exactly. And there comes a point where you can't draw the line anywhere because there's always going to be disagreement about where the line should be. And also, we do recognize to some extent that humans need a certain amount of adversity. Humans need something to struggle against, or else we turn into fairly horrifying people. I don't know if any
Speak
of you
a
have spent
billionaire.
time with children who have not been allowed to struggle with anything in their lives because their parents insisted that everything be perfect for them. But those
Mhm.
are not necessarily the kids I actually want to hang out with.
And they've actually there's this book called The Confidence Code, which
Yes.
specifically focuses on gender diversity, and for especially for like really smart kids who are socialized as girls,
Yes.
they are not told, "Well, keep trying and you'll do better," or whatever, the way that like boys who misbehave are. And so
Sure.
they don't learn because things come naturally and they're not told to keep trying or work harder, they don't learn how to face adversity. And so then it's harder to actually be confident when they finally reach, like, they're not challenged enough.
Yeah.
And then when they are challenged, they're not as prepared for it because it has been so much easier.
Yeah. So the characterization of the free will, where should you draw the line argument that I learned in high school and is not terribly reverent, let's say, is what's called the extra drippy ice cream cone argument. Because by golly, if we're going to get rid of evil, then I want to be able to eat my ice cream cone before it melts.
I just want my ice cream cone to have ice cream in the bottom.
See, I'm lactose intolerant, so this argument no longer actually applies to me at all.
I mean, you could have sorbet.
Not in a cone. That doesn't sound. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah, that
Um,
doesn't sound right.
I think we can all agree, basically, that you don't want to take it as far as God preserves your ice cream cone for you, because we do need a little more adversity than that. Is basically what that line it means. And if you want a illustration of that, the sci-fi author Orson Scott Card has some issues, like, wow, but he did write a book that's a collection of short stories called the Worthing Saga, in which there is a novella called the Worthing Chronicle, which explores what a world looks like when free will has essentially been taken away from people because all of the worst kinds of sufferings have been removed from their lives without their agreement. Because there is a person who is able to do so and wants to reduce the suffering in their lives. And then one day that stops and they start having suffering again and they have to go through that process and it sucks. And it's a really interesting exploration of the whole free will argument on the whole, which I
Yeah.
definitely appreciated.
That also reminded me of The Giver, and that
Yes.
space where, like, The Giver is designed to eliminate suffering, and it doesn't actually, right? Like, people are
Right.
still committing atrocious acts. They just don't have it framed that way, and so don't realize it's the, like, pre-knowledge.
Yeah.
Don't realize what they are doing and how harmful it is. Yeah. So the way that I've always learned and thought about it, maybe not always, but since I've been learning and thinking about theodicy, the way
Sure.
that makes the most sense to me for thinking about, like, why evil exists is, and kind of like what evil actually is
Yeah.
still connected to free will, right? And free will in and of itself is a good thing. It is good that God gave us free will. And, like, part of it is God doesn't want robots or, like,
Sheep. Yeah.
or sheep. Yeah, like, non-human animals don't have the capacity in the same way that humans do to love God. Though there are non-human animals that,
Understand more than we think.
yeah, experience empathy and feelings and that sort of thing. But we're going to not count that part, like, not think about that part for a minute. Free will for humans is good. It is how we are able to love God
And each other.
and each other. And it can be twisted to
Sure.
be used for evil. And I think for me, evil, any evil that we're looking at is actually, like, or at least the majority, is actually rooted in something that's not evil, but it has been twisted to be
Right.
evil. So free will means we get to love each other and love God, and we can not love each other.
Yes.
We can choose to harm each other. But there's also, like, protecting or valuing, right? Valuing who I come from, the family I come from, the community I come from is not evil. Valuing it over and above everybody else and thinking I am better than, like, my particular community, origins, country, race is better than everybody else,
Sure.
is evil, right?
Yeah.
So there's like that where it starts in one spot, but it can get bigger. It can become evil.
Yeah.
And, like, that is the case not just with, like, ideas of like white supremacy, but with anything. There's anything that we do, any good can be twisted to become evil.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the good isn't good.
Yeah. Also, I feel like there's a whole ton and a half of fiction that is based on that concept. Taking
Yes.
something that should be good and twisting it for evil and then twisting it back so that it's good again and all that. Yeah. I also feel like this is a good time to bring up the book of Job in the Bible because this is something that everyone wants to talk about when it comes to good and evil. I would remind you that the book of Job essentially is a parable. It's also the oldest book in the Bible. We're not entirely clear how old it is, but like super, super old, and
Hmm.
therefore based in a culture very different than ours, and also not necessarily a culture we have a ton of information about. And so I would encourage you, if you want to look into the book of Job, don't worry about the whole God betting Satan thing and what causes Job suffering in the first place. Like, that is not really the heart of the book. The heart of the book of Job is Job's conversations with his various friends who show up. He has three friends who show up at first, and then an additional friend who shows up later. And the three so-called friends suck. Like, they're not great people. And the
I mean,
things that they are telling Job,
they start out okay.
they start out okay, and then they
With
get worse and worse and
Job,
worse.
and
Yeah.
then they get worse.
And then they open their mouths. Yeah,
And
basically.
yeah,
And
exactly.
if you want a list of things not to say to your friend when your friend is suffering, these guys do a lovely job of listing almost all of them. And I
Mhm.
would suggest, if you don't spend a lot of time with the Bible, or if you aren't, just into the very weird ways that the Bible can phrase things, because translating from one language to another language over the course of several thousand years is going to do things to that, I would suggest that you try the Common English Bible, which is not,
Mhm. Not the CEV, the
yes, not the CEV,
CEB.
the CEB, B as in Bible.
Very different.
Yes. And the Common English Bible is a good but also very understandable and relatable translation. And you should be able to understand what his friends are saying.
It's one of the newest translations.
Yes, and it does a lovely job of making things clear.
Yeah, it has significantly fewer he's and hims, I believe, for God as
That too.
well.
Yeah.
Not all gone, but fewer.
Yeah. And so the first three friends of Job are just not great. But if you want a list of things not to say to your friends who are suffering, they are lovely for that. And then the fourth friend is interesting. Like, God definitely approves of the fourth friend. He says a lot less crappy stuff than the other friends do. But
Mhm.
it sort of depends on what your emotions toward God are at the moment as to whether or not you're going to like him. Let's put it that way. There are days when I don't like the fourth friend very much. That's fine. But those conversations are a large part of how do we react as humans to evil? How do we react as humans to suffering? And
Mhm.
you will find yourself saying, "Oh, yeah, I've met this person before," as you read these friends. And it
Yeah.
is remarkable how some things just don't change. So, I think ultimately speaking, my answer to the question of if God is all loving and all powerful and also exists, why does evil exist, is that evil doesn't actually have to. Evil comes from us. We don't have to live in a world like this. We don't have to live in a world with evil and suffering. We can alleviate a lot of both. But we
Mhm.
choose not to. We have historically chosen not to for a number
Mhm.
of reasons that also, mostly suck.
Yeah.
And that is a conversation that we have when we form our societies.
Yeah. And I think I would agree with that. And I think part of it too is like, yes, we don't have to. And currently, there are systems that are set up that we
Yes,
need to change in order to actually make those changes to eliminate or at least significantly decrease evil. And it is
because
hard.
oddly enough, evil's been around for quite a while and has had some time to set up.
Indeed, it has. And it's so rooted into things like capitalism and the ways,
Our legal systems.
I was going to say, in this country, like the racism built into our legal system,
Yeah,
the classism built into our criminal justice system, the transphobia that is being built ever more clearly into our laws. And it doesn't have to be this way, but we've gotten to the point where we need big movements. And
yeah,
the way we've taught history is to point to one single person who leads a movement and ignore the entire group of people that were necessary
yeah.
to lead the movement, so that none of us feel like we could ever be Martin Luther King Jr. But really, there was also a Bayard Rustin. There
There
were
was also
so
Rosa
many.
Parks, who was
There was
trained
also Rosa
and
Parks.
chose to do that day on purpose
Mm-hmm.
as part of a movement.
There,
Yeah.
yeah, there are so many who were part of the civil rights movement to make it happen. not just one man.
Yeah.
So part of it is like we need to do better at learning our history so that we have models and can think about ways of organizing and making change that are group efforts.
Yeah.
And we need to be reminded that care of another person does not put us at risk. It actually keeps us safer. Community care keeps us way safer than trying to hoard or protect or isolate.
Yeah.
Diving into our readings for this episode, our first reading is Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 through 9, which was one of the readings for my ordination.
Oh.
I mean, 1 through 11, but close enough.
Okay.
God announces an everlasting covenant with the people of King David, that God will continue to listen to them and forgive them, because God's ways are different from our ways. So when I was reading this, part of what I love about this passage is it is so very clearly anti-capitalist. Like, anyone who is hungry, come and eat. Anyone who's thirsty, come and drink. No money, come, eat, drink, get what you need.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of the Wizard of Oz series. So a while back, I was like several years ago now, I was actually reading the Wizard of Oz series before bed because the books are written for kids. And L. Frank Baum uses queer all the time. And I love it. And it's delightful. Like the way that the word queer is used is just delightful in it. But they don't have like big, scary plots that will like keep my brain awake. So I was like reading them on my way to bed. Anyway, and it's like the whole series is like, does anyone actually ever work? Or just like go on adventures and like eat whatever you find? Unless, of course, the tree gets mad at you for taking its apples, in which case you should probably have asked first and checked on that.
Being polite is good. Yeah.
But yeah, it's the whole system there. It's just like people are like responsible for ruling things, but like it is not clear if anybody ever actually works. Yeah. And I like it.
And then in verse 1, we read, Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you that have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price. And if we have any musical fans out there, this verse is referenced at the start of the musical of Brigadoon. I imagine in the standard script, but specifically I'm thinking of the movie starring Gene Kelly. When he and his friend first enter the town of Brigadoon and try to pay for the food that they would like to buy with modern money. And then the guy who's getting married in town that day comes up and offers to treat them in honor of his wedding that day, which is really lovely.
Is Brigadoon like a time travel thing?
Sort of. The town is time traveling for reasons that are explained in the story. The town only exists for one day every 100 years. And so they happen upon it on that day, and it's at that point 200 years old. So it's like stepping back into time for Gene Kelly and his friend.
Gotcha. Fascinating.
It's an ancient legend that was later turned into a musical.
Gotcha. And then in verse 2, the first half of verse 2, we read, Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? And it reminded me actually of the Doctor Who episode called Gridlock, where like everybody is stuck in a perpetual state of gridlock, rush hour traffic, but like 24/7 is rush hour.
Yeah.
And in the underneath part in the city, you can actually like buy feelings or emotions to consume and to experience. So it's like, oh yeah, spending money for that which is not bread, spending money on emotional experiences that are not actually genuine.
Yeah.
Just so you can feel something, because everything is so disconnected and dystopic.
Which would explain a lot about Hollywood.
Yeah.
And then in verse 8 we read, For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, says the Lord. And there are days when I think that I'm supposed to take this verse as being, sad on our part, because we are not like God. But often enough, I have to say, I actually take this verse as a good thing, because God is not like us. And that can definitely be a good thing.
That's
see our earlier conversation about evil, for example.
Right?
And it reminds me of an episode of The Orville. I'm pretty sure that the title of the episode is Nothing Left on Earth Excepting Fishes. although I'm not entirely certain about that. And yes, I'm pretty sure that is a line from The King and I, to go back to the whole musical thing. But there is an episode in the Orville where Ed realizes that there is something weird about the woman who he's dating, because she watches the first Indiana Jones movie with him, and she's not rooting against the bad guys. Like, she thinks the bad guys are supposed to be the ones she's rooting for. And that definitely, like, granted, Indiana Jones doesn't have a ton of the cultural context that backs all that up and explains who those people are, but it's still kind of terrifying, and that gets explored.
Yeah.
There's a reason for it.
I haven't seen Indiana Jones in a long time, but is that the one with the Nazis trying to find?
Nazis. Yeah.
Okay, because I was like,
It's not entirely, like, you're expected to know who the Nazis are, and it's not really, yeah. So
yeah,
it's not really clear on whether or not she knows who they are exactly, but yeah.
yeah. Because I was gonna say, in general, I find, especially for like Disney movies more so, but like the evil characters are often the queer coded characters, and the, like,
Yes.
rooting for the evil ones is actually like not always the.
And sometimes
Depends
they're
on
the
your
smarter
framing.
ones, and sometimes they get the better one-liners, and like,
Mhm.
it's all depends on how you
Yeah.
write them. Yeah.
Mhm. But not when they're Nazis.
No, exactly.
Nazis are bad.
Yes.
Just to be perfectly clear.
Yes.
In verse 9, we read, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So we picked different verses, but the verses are actually almost identical, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it, and like, you know that vigilantes like Rich Boy Batman actually think this. Like, they are the ones who are saying what God is saying, and saying, my ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. I know how to do this better than you do.
Yeah.
And like in the Avengers, they actually get in trouble for that because of that, because they're like, no, we don't have to be held accountable. And there's complicated things, and Hydra is like infiltrating Shield, and that's all complicated, blah blah blah. But also, like, there has to be some sort of accountability for people who are literally like potentially killing others.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Our second reading for this episode is from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 13. Paul reminds the Corinthians of many trials that the Jewish people faced over the centuries, despite being loved by God, and exhorts them to not make the same mistakes as were made then.
So this passage, Paul was just like super annoying. I don't know what it was about, like, my preparation. It was just like, Paul, come on now. This is some major retconning or retroactive continuity here.
Yep.
Like, Paul is going back and reinterpreting things that have happened in a whole different way than was intended. And so it reminded me of when, and this happens all the time in comics. It's just like, sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's obvious. But it's like in the X-Men comics, when for Jean Grey, when Professor X retconned it all and was like, she had the Phoenix in there the whole time. I had just repressed it. It's like,
yeah, because someone knows better than everyone else. Never heard that one before.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And as we jump into the verses, we read in verse 1, I do not want you to be unaware, siblings, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Okay, so sometimes I deal with Paul by just taking his words in ways he didn't expect.
Which I love.
Yes, and is usually a good time, and also reminds me that, like, Paul is a colleague, and maybe I don't have to take him quite as seriously as he takes himself. And which, like, if I was
Maybe, in
going to take
fact,
him
we
as seriously
shouldn't.
as he takes himself, I would be, like, all serious all the time, and that's boring. I realize that this verse probably has a deeper spiritual meaning to Paul, but I also claim that it could be evidence of the Bible encouraging the theory of evolution, and that we all originally evolved from sea amoebas. Like, that's what passing through the sea means, right? So I'm just saying that's an option.
That's fantastic. Whereas I read that verse and I was thinking of a river instead of the sea.
Sure.
And it sounds to me like the beginning of the movie Encanto. So not the beginning of the actual movie, but the beginning of like the particular story that the family traces itself back to, which is a passing through a river and then being at risk, and there's like a fight and protection that happens and
Sure.
all of that. but that they did pass through the water in order to get to a safer place.
Yeah. And then in verse 8, we read, "We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day." Okay, so before we all panic, I would like to point out that sometimes Paul refers back to stories from the Hebrew scriptures and forgets to give verse references and forgets to give any sense of context whatsoever. And
Mm-hmm.
for example, this story that he's referencing here is from Numbers chapter 25. It involves the Jewish people committing acts of idol worship, which include sexual acts that almost certainly included some really serious consent issues, the way
Mm-hmm.
it's described there. And so, yeah, God's objecting to that because that's a horrible thing to do.
Yeah, because consent is good and necessary and
Yes,
important.
absolutely. And God reacts rather forcefully to that. And so having the reference and understanding what's the context of what's going on definitely helps in understanding what the heck Paul is saying here. I like to take this verse, among many, many, many other verses from Paul, as a reminder that Paul really could have used an editor and also probably a graduate advisor to remind him to cite his sources properly. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Paul
Or
did not go to
footnotes.
grad school, and sometimes it shows.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then in verse 13, we read, "No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful and will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, God will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it." This is like real textbook hashtag bad theology. And I just want to be like, Paul, no, no, Paul, go home. So, to be perfectly clear, not everything that is bad is God testing you. And I think this, we didn't
Yes.
really get into this as much in our theodicy conversation, but we kind of like, we operated under that assumption and maybe didn't say it out explicitly. But like, not everything that is bad is testing, and not everything that tests you is from God.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really just the DM trying to slow your party down a bit so they can catch up and get ahead of you.
Yeah. Although I think there's also a bit from that first line of that verse, "No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone." It reminds me of a,
That's also a lie.
well, to some extent, but there's a book that I had to read in high school called "I Never Promised You a Rose Garden" that's about mental illness and
Mm,
the horrible way that people who were struggling with mental illness were treated back in the 60s. And there's a repeated line in that of one character reminding another that you don't have a corner on suffering.
mm,
You are not the only person who's ever suffered. You have not suffered like you may have suffered more than some people, but you probably are not like the absolute most suffered person in the universe.
mm-hmm,
That kind of thing. And I think also when we talk about theodicy and suffering and all of that, it's important to remember that, your suffering probably sucked, sure,
mm-hmm.
but also other people have too.
Yeah,
And
it's not a
their suffering
suffering.
may have been different, but yeah, that doesn't invalidate your suffering, does not invalidate theirs, and vice versa.
Yeah, it's not a suffering Olympics.
Right.
You don't need to like.
Those would be the worst Olympics. Don't have those.
Yeah, there's well, and there's like the thing called the oppression Olympics where people are like compare like, well, I'm impressed in this way and I'm impressed, and a lot of it like there are particular ways that different groups especially but different groups and different people suffer, and those are important to take into account to lead us towards empathy,
Yeah.
not to point fingers or those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And
Or to tear anyone else down.
mm-hmm. And one of the congregations I served several years ago had this wall hanging, and I don't remember exactly what it said, but I loved it because it was the first time I had seen a congregation have a theology that was like really helpful. And they had experienced a flood before I got there, and so knew like scary stuff. And it was that God doesn't promise that life will be perfect, that there will be no suffering. God
Right.
promises to be with you in the suffering,
Yeah.
to not abandon
Yeah.
you and to not leave you. And that I think makes a huge difference. And I would love for Paul to have edited this to actually like be reflective of that more
Yeah.
explicitly, but alas,
Absolutely.
he's Paul.
Yeah. And I'm also willing to give a certain amount of leeway for translation issues.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
maybe not all the leeway. Maybe just some.
Yeah. And then in our final reading for this episode is Luke chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. The crowd brings up the cruelty of the Romans to Jesus, who reminds them that those who died hadn't sinned any more or less than anyone else. Jesus then tells the parable of the fig tree and the gardener, who asked for one more year so it could bear fruit. So one of the themes in this passage is the empire, in this case, the Roman Empire, causing harm. And I'm somewhat rewatching The Mandalorian, and it reminded me of chapter 13, which is also known as season 2, episode 5, The Jedi. And on the planet Corvus, there's a Jedi, Ahsoka Tano, who is confronting the Imperial Magistrate Morgan Elsbeth, who is like ruling Calodan, the city of Calodan. And I'm probably pronouncing things terribly because I read the names of the cities, I didn't hear them.
Sure.
And this is like after the original trilogy takes place and before the latest trilogy.
Sure.
And so the Empire is not supposed to exist, and yet the magistrate is still there and in power. And the magistrate is like blaming the suffering of the people of Calodan on Ahsoka, the Jedi, who is trying to fight to liberate the people.
Sure.
And so it's this like, it feels like that's what the crowd is doing too, right? Like there's this trying to blame it on like individual personal responsibility when in fact it is the role of the government in this. We did it we have done it throughout the pandemic, right? We blame individual choice instead of recognizing the huge failure of the government to act on behalf of the people within its borders and within the world to
or for that matter,
apparently
the president is solely responsible for the price of gas as opposed to, the gas companies wanting to make more money.
Yep.
Yeah. In verse 2, we read, Jesus asked them, "Do you think that because these Galileans suffered in this way, they were worse sinners than all other Galileans?" And I would like to point out, again, as I have previously on this podcast, because on the rare occasion when God does smite people, God also tells us that God smited them. Okay?
Smote?
Yes, I realize that there are multiple possibilities for the past tense. This is not a word that we use on a regular basis, and so I am trying to use grammar that, sounds normal.
But smote is more fun. It sounds
It is, but it
dragonish.
also sounds like something got stuck in your eye.
Oh.
So, like a mote in your eye. So, I
was
prefer
thinking
smited.
smote like a dragon. Like it sounds smoky and dragonish.
Oh, possibly. Yeah, okay. That would be a good dragon name. But if God does not tell us that God smited someone, then it wasn't God smiting them, okay? There is a science fiction, well, there was, he's dead now. There was a science fiction author named Robert Heinlein who had a rule called Heinlein's razor.
Is it like Occam's razor?
Yes, people named it that because they saw the similarity to Occam's razor.
Okay.
But his rule was never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Which, if you think about it, it does make sense.
Well, I would replace stupidity with like ignorance or something, but yeah.
Well, yes, it's not the ideal word, but yet so descriptive. Yeah. And I think that we can definitely add a corollary to it, not just in the modern world, but also in the ancient world. Never attribute to divine intervention that which is adequately explained by human nature. It's not necessarily true that God did this to you. It is very possible that people did this to you. It is also very possible that people did this and then it wound up affecting you and people didn't expect that or didn't especially care. So
yeah. As we move into verse 4, Jesus says, "Or those 18 who were killed when the Tower of Siloam fell on them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem?" And it actually reminded me of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911.
Yeah.
And then, like, last year, the fire at Hashem Foods in Bangladesh, right? It's still empire and very much explicitly capitalism, but it's like trying to cut corners and not provide protections and pay to the ones who are doing the work so that companies can like increase and protect their profit margin
to the exclusion of everything else.
Yep. There's a concept that the Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus kind of coined, which is social business, which like has a different way of defining profit, and it includes like how something impacts the earth and how something impacts the community and like how the community
Yeah.
benefit. And so like this verse in this situation,
That sounds like a great idea.
don't do that. But
Yeah,
I
no.
love the idea of like social business, because
Yeah.
it says,
Absolutely.
how is my business doing good in the world?
Yeah.
And some of that is like earning me enough money to live and buy the things I need. But also some of it is
Also,
being
like,
kind to the
living in a better
environment.
world is profitable to you. Like, literally.
Mhm.
That's, yeah.
Yeah, it is. So.
Yeah. And then in verse 6 we read, Then Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So there is a TV show called Leverage that I have referenced in this podcast before. And they had an episode focusing on a Catholic church that included a brief homily by the priest of that church on the parable of the fig tree. A very, very short homily.
Was it during Lent? Was the priest wearing purple?
I believe the priest was not wearing purple. I believe the priest was wearing white for some reason, which is, yeah, that's a good point. Huh.
They did not have a religious consultant for that episode.
I think that was not a Sunday mass. I think that was a like day of the week mass, if I remember correctly. So
Okay.
that's a different lectionary.
I see.
But anyway, well, actually, that might be wrong. I don't remember. Now that's going to bug me. But to be fair, the show did not exactly like do a plus job on portraying religion, and I'll get into that in a minute. But this homily was on the scale of like TV trying to portray what sermons are like. This was not terrible. Also, not fantastic, but definitely not terrible. The priest essentially used this text and this homily to tell the main characters to calm down and just let things happen rather than rushing. Because sometimes what you really need to do is to give the situation some time. And on the whole, I'd say I would give the show a solid B on handling religion. Like it's not terrible. Also, not absolutely the best, but it could be a lot worse. They did okay. So
I do think like giving the situation time. Susanna Porter, who's been a guest on the podcast a couple times, talks about the gift of time, and I think that's particularly like something that I still sometimes need to get used to. But I think especially for people in situations where they've been abused or they've been in less than ideal situations, like to have the gift.
Sometimes it just takes time.
Have the gift of time, but also to like give yourself the gift of time before you respond when somebody wants your time. So instead of just saying, oh, there's nothing on my calendar, I can say yes to this. Pause. Tell them, I have to check my calendar. I'll get back to you, and tell them the next day. And even if you don't have a calendar event, you can either A, schedule one so you don't lie, or B, say, I'm not available then, which is still not a lie.
Yeah.
But yeah, the gift of time is very important and very helpful in taking care of ourselves. And then in verse 7, Jesus continues the parable and says, So the man said to the gardener, See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil? So first off, fig trees take about 3 to 5 years to bear fruit. So,
it's a baby fig tree.
Yeah, it's like this is the first year possible.
Yeah.
But then I was wondering if it's 3 to 5 years for a fig tree to bear fruit, how long do you think it takes for the purple flowers in Wakanda to generate the properties to create the Black Panther? Like, are they perennials? Do they need time to like?
And that's definitely an issue after the Black Panther movie, because they don't have that many of them left.
They don't have any of them left, right? Like, I don't know.
No, they saved one.
They saved one, but they used it on the Black Panther.
Right. But the plant was still alive. They used the bud, but
Okay.
of the one they saved.
That's true.
I think.
That's fair.
So it could grow again, but I don't know how long that takes.
Right.
And yeah, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And then our final segment for this episode is, of course, let's make a Muppets musical, because we had a conversation with Rabbi Danya Rutenberg on Twitter that involved casting Muppets in the Bible. And of course, if you're going to have a Muppet Bible musical, there are going to have to be occasional characters who are played by human beings as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the Twitter thread kind of exploded, and also we were just having a lot of fun, so we decided to bring it into the podcast.
Mm-hmm. And if you want to weigh in on who you would cast in let's make a Muppets musical. It can be about the particular scene or story arc that we are talking about here, or it can be about a different one. You can weigh in on social media because we'll post each week, probably around Friday-ish is my thought, but we'll see.
Yeah.
And invite everybody to weigh in on how they would cast the humans and the Muppets.
Yes.
So.
Yes. So we looked at the readings for this episode, and we decided to talk about our gospel reading, which at least has a story referenced in it. And of course, Pilate does some horrible things here. And I have to say, I don't think I could stand Pilate of all the characters being played by a Muppet, because I think he needs to be played by a person, because otherwise that just does not take the level of all of the stuff that he does seriously enough.
Yeah.
And so I think he has to be played by a person. And I have to say that when we started talking about casting the Bible musical with Muppets conversation, I was not really expecting to say this sentence out loud at some point, but okay, sure, that all makes sense. And I was thinking it needs to be someone who's clinical and foreboding. I would also say that I think that Pilate is one of the very few characters in the Bible who actually can be played by a white man.
Yes. Yeah. So I was thinking about it and I was like, well, who plays Emperor Palpatine on Star Wars?
Ian McDiarmid. And he's actually still alive. I hate to say this, sir, but I was kind of surprised. But he's 77, and he's still alive.
But then I was thinking about two others came to mind that I think maybe would be even more calculating and brilliant.
Well, I do like that. I would say if I was going to go with someone from Star Wars, I would have gone with Grand Moff Tarkin, who is played by Peter Cushing, who is like the first Imperial fleet guy that we run into, and just has the whole evil thing down. That is, yeah. So he could also do it.
Also, so I was thinking in the TV show Heroes, which was like,
oh yes,
it's not the
10 years ago.
Yeah, it was like 10 years ago. Siler, or Gabriel Gray, who's played by Zachary Quinto,
who also played Spock in the Star Trek remake.
Yeah. So he was one that I was thinking about, though I'm not sure that he's actually white.
Well, he's definitely Jewish, so he might have some issues with playing.
Yeah. So then we should not cast him. But
he's definitely capable of pulling off the evil aura thing, which is just a sign of being a good actor.
For sure. The other one that I was thinking of was the guy that plays Dexter.
Oh yes, I have not watched that show, but I have seen the occasional outtake, and yeah, he can do that too.
Yeah, the serial killer who kills serial killers.
Yeah. However, my comment on Pilate being one of the few characters in the Bible that could be played by a white man also made me think of Jonathan Groff from Hamilton playing King George. That is probably not a great choice for Pilate, but I did enjoy that momentary mental image for a second there. So.
That would be hilarious.
And therefore probably not where we're actually going.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Maybe not so much, but yeah. There are a lot of white guys who would, would be a good pilot. Yeah.
Which, again, we would hope is just a sign of being a good actor and not actually being that evil in real life.
Yeah, we would hope. Thank you for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the fourth Sunday in Lent with our special guest, Reverend Nikira Hernandez. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said,
Pax Vobiscum.